Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Alumni Week event, Life After COVID-19. What does it really mean to build back better? My name is Robert Dixon, and I am the Executive Director of Advancement in the Faculty of Community Services. We are so excited about this panel today. We can't wait to dive into the discussion. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce our new Dean in the Faculty of Community Services, Dr. Chiaris Garabaghi, who will be moderating our panel discussion this afternoon. Dr. Garabaghi is a respected academic leader with over 20 years of experience in community engagement and program development. He served as director of the School of Child and Youth Care and as the John C. Eaton Chair in Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship before becoming Dean last month. Most recently, Chiaris co-launched the Terry Project, a new virtual placement initiative that seeks to ease the loneliness of long-term care residents amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Chiaris, and thank you for moderating our discussion today.
Thank you, Robert. It's a real pleasure to welcome everybody. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the land. As you know, Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And you know, I do this land acknowledgement, as we always do, recognizing, of course, that simply acknowledging the land in words is hardly a response to many, many decades, centuries of very, very difficult and at times brutalizing times. And so we're very conscious in this institution that the name of our institution has to some degree carried the legacy of these times and continues to carry it as we speak. As you know, Ryerson University has made a commitment following the recommendations of the Standing Strong Task Force to change its name. And we are all incredibly excited about that. In fact, we are very happy that as an institution, we are championing this process of changing the name, as opposed to standing in the way of a process that must unfold. I also want to say that, you know, in acknowledging the land, we're using words to demonstrate respect, but the onus is on us as an institution, as a public place, to demonstrate action. And it's also important that we know that the recommendations that this institution is going to follow through on are not simply just to change its name, but there are 21 other recommendations that are substantive and that speak to the way in which we are with people, and in particular with Indigenous people in our context. And so the onus is always on us to demonstrate action, not just to use words that may at times lack authenticity if they're not followed up by action. That said, we have an exciting panel coming your way. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, especially knowing who the panelists are. And so it's a real pleasure to have an opportunity to moderate this panel. It is, of course, a panel about the pandemic, or so we say, and we are in particular interested in what happens, or how we build back, or how we come out of this pandemic and develop or contribute to the development of stronger and more resilient communities. We want to be forward-looking. We want to think about what can be better, what do we learn from this experience, and what can we do better. Having said that, talking about a pandemic, talking about this pandemic is itself in many ways reflective of a particular way of being situated in our communities, in our society. We all know we've experienced this time very differently based on how we're situated and how we're located in society. And so we want to respect the fact that there are many different ways of really finding a point of entry into a discussion about the pandemic, and we'll explore all of those through the eyes of our panelists. Today's discussion is, of course, recorded, and we will be sending you a link to that recording at the end of the day. And we really hope that you'll share the recording. Whatever might come out of the discussion, it may well be interesting to your networks, the people you communicate with regularly. So we really do encourage you to share that link when you receive it. Okay, let me introduce the panelists. And to do quite frankly, that in and of itself could take an hour and a half, but I'll keep it short. And to also be respectful to the information and ensure that it's factual, I will read the introduction. So forgive me for that if I'm looking down. But I will start with our first panelist, Dr. Pamela Robinson. She's a professor and the director of the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Ryerson. Throughout her career as a planner, her research and practice have focused on complex, emergent challenges that Canadian communities face. Her current research focuses on the question, who is planning the Canadian smart city? In 2020, Pamela received the inaugural Canadian Institute of Planners President's Award Academic. She's an advisor on the Toronto Public Library's Innovation Council and serves on the board of directors for the Metcalfe Foundation. Welcome, Pamela. I'd like to introduce Dr. Beverly Jean Daniel. Dr. Beverly Jean Daniel is an assistant professor in the School of Child and Youth Care. Her research publications and community work focus on the education sector and the factors that promote academic, personal, and career success amongst Black community members. She has been a strong proponent for addressing anti-Black racism and its impact on Black communities. In addition to her academic experience, she has worked in the areas of diversity training and developing cultural competence for over 15 years. She has worked closely with schools, organizational leaders, and frontline staff to strategically enhance the organizational environment, and she possesses in-depth knowledge of diversity-related policies. Welcome, Beverly Jean. Dr. Josephine Wong, professor and research chair in urban health, has extensive experience in critical public health and urban health promotion, including the development of access and equity policy, public health practice frameworks, and community-based capacity building programs to promote health equity. Currently, she is leading PROTEC, a COVID-19 rapid response research to mitigate the negative impacts of racism, psychosocial distress, and grief on Asian Canadian communities, as well as reducing stress among frontline healthcare providers. Welcome, Josephine. And we have Dr. Jordan Tustin, an assistant professor in the School of Occupational and Public Health. She's a Canadian Field Epidemiologist Fellow, a CIHR Public Health Policy Fellow, a certified Canadian Public Health Inspector, and was awarded with the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for her service to public health in Canada and abroad. She has extensive field experience in communicable disease investigations and response at the local, provincial, federal, and international levels. She's currently involved in several COVID-19 research projects focusing on sociodemographic impacts and the experience of vulnerable populations. Welcome, Justin. I'm delighted to have this panel in front of all of us. This is going to be an exciting discussion. Welcome again to all of you. And I think we're ready to get started. Okay, so I'm going to ask a series of questions. You can each answer and take as much time and answer in whatever way you deem appropriate. I may have some additional questions on the same topic, but we want to really move from where we are to the hopes and the possibilities for the future as we go through the discussion. And you know, our first topic that, if you don't mind responding to, really is about the social inequalities that have existed long before this pandemic. But I'm also very conscious that that language often sort of drives the way we think about a question. And so I don't want to use a lot of language and instead encourage you to find your own entry point into a panel that is about talking about sort of the past 18 months and what might come beyond it. So I invite you to find your own entry point and to speak to it as you see fit. And perhaps we'll start with you, Pamela, and see what you would like to share.
Thank you so much. I'll probably keep this short so we can get everyone's ideas flowing. I think and the panelists who are going to follow will have some really poignant and important points about just how challenging this pandemic has been landing in equity-seeking and marginalized communities of people. And one of the things about FCS that is so robust is that we have researchers and faculty members and students who are members of those communities, but also trying to use their role inside a university to do research and practice that can make a difference on the ground. You know, as a planner, one of the things that was very hard for me to see, in addition to the tremendous civil rights challenges that we were facing, is the failure of our ability to provide the basic necessities of life in the forms of things like affordable housing, access to fresh and healthy food, safe and financially accessible ways for people to move around the city. During the pandemic, some of us had the luxury of being able to work from home, while other people still had to travel to go to work as essential workers. And they were exposed to more risk than some of us were. But also their movement around the city wasn't any easier. And the distances they had to travel are farther than some people because places that are affordable to live aren't located close to the work that was available for them to do. And so the pandemic really shone light, I think, on the failures of our city building practices and really redoubled attention and focus on how we need to do better moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Pamela. Thank you for those ideas. Beverly Jean, would you like to speak to what is your entry point into this kind of a discussion?
You know, I think if I build on what Pamela said around the idea that the pandemic exposed it, for me, I sort of asked the question, exposed it to whom? Right? Because those who've been living with these inequalities have always been very much aware of it. They've been very much aware of the challenges. But I think what we're talking about here is the way in which realities that have been experienced in some ways by racialized groups. And if I look at my sort of primary focus group, which is sort of Black communities, that these are issues that we've been struggling with, complaining about, writing about for generations. I think what has happened with this pandemic is that it's, you know, in addition to the pandemic occurring, there was also the murder of George Floyd. So there was a sort of a confluence of events that came together at the same time that we didn't have the choice to look away from it. We didn't have the option to go back to our everyday lives. You then had those issues layered on by the increasing anti-Asian attacks, both in the US and here in Canada. So there were these sort of multiple events all occurring at the same time that forced the world to look, right? We didn't have the luxury of looking away. And I think that's really the starting point of recognizing that these issues have always been there, but those who have had the privilege not to see were suddenly faced with having their eyes almost stuck open, so they didn't have a choice but to see.
Thank you. Justin, do you want to carry on that thought or bring your own?
Thanks. I think for me, I'm coming more in a sort of public health planning and response perspective, where in the fact that these inequalities are not new challenges, they're not unknown. Health equity is part of public health program and planning, and we've had several experiences in the past. For example, we did have another pandemic, H1N1, where lockdown measures were used in that pandemic in Mexico. We've had several public health emergencies of international concern, like the Ebola pandemic. We had SARS in Toronto, and Public Health Agency of Canada evolved from that, and Public Health Ontario. So these are not new issues, they're not new challenges. However, they're not always adequately addressed. We don't learn from lessons from the past. And within this pandemic, it wasn't until fairly far along in the pandemic that we were actually trying to identify and understand the different socio-demographic characteristics of the population. So we didn't even have that data, or we're using that data. So I think really for me, it's about lessons learned from the past and how we can really make sure that we hold on to these lessons moving forward and actually use these lessons and these data for action and not just discussion.
Excellent points. Josephine, what is your entry point?
I think that many really important points had already been raised. And I think one of the main challenges at the beginning of the pandemic is that because the coronavirus is a communicable disease, so then the concentration is really into the biomedical model. And I agree with Jordan, who just said that, we didn't have data, but actually we did have data. And what I really appreciate that had developed over the last 20 years is actually the geographic information system. That become a tool where we can actually talk about inequities in health, social inequities, income inequalities, on a map where ordinary people actually can understand, and had been used by the mainstream media. Toronto Star had their map and all that stuff. And we didn't find anything new throughout the pandemic. So when we map out the racialized poverty, how people in low-income neighborhoods, who they are, racialized people, Black people, and then we map the high number of cases of the coronavirus, the COVID pandemic onto it, surely it maps. And this is something we had known for the last 20 years. And so I feel very much, as Beverly said, that things had converged together. We can no longer ignore it. But what touched me in the summer of 2020 that was really heart-wrenching was when my racialized students, Black students, actually cried and talk about it's not just a pandemic, that they're working 14 hours, 7 to 14 shift, like nonstop. Is when what happened with George Floyd, and they witness it, we collectively witness it, their children watch it, and they have to explain that it was really heart-wrenching. And some of them told me that they were not sure whether they could come to class because we're talking about colonialism and racism in the class. And so those type of things, for some people, as Beverly pointed out, is not just knowing that there's inequities. For some people, it's being re-traumatized and had to live with the chronic inequalities and racism that they face every day. And so that is very heart-wrenching. And for me, that was really, really powerful. And that we can turn back. We're not at a crossroad. Either you're on a path to fight for justice and fairness, or you're actually not supporting, then we are complicit. So that's how I feel about the pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you for those points. I just want to pick up briefly on Jordan's comment about learning from the past. And of course, it's very interesting. We learned a lot from the financial crisis of 2008, knowing that that crisis impacted, in many cases, sometimes financial institutions that are run by very wealthy people. We learned nothing at all from a pandemic from pandemics that have really, really impacted very significantly marginalized communities. Not that the financial crisis didn't, but this pandemic certainly has, and we don't seem to draw any lessons. That's interesting, I think. I also think it's interesting that we have panels about pandemics when for some people, really the story of the last 18 months is not a pandemic. It is the sort of not the appearance, but rather the ugly manifestation of racism as it has always existed, but in particularly brutalizing ways. And so very interesting, and that's why I asked you about entry points, so that we have a range of things that we can consider. Also, a brief apology to my colleague Jordan, who I previously referred to as Justin. So I'm sorry, your last name is Tustin. So that got me confused.
I answer to Justin because people do it all the time. So
okay.
no worries.
Okay, I'm sorry nevertheless. So Beverly Jean had already made reference to the convergence of different issues of racism, of the health pandemic, and so on. I wonder if you could all speak a little bit to how you feel a variety or a range of issues have converged during these past 18 months to really make this a very unique moment in our history and in our presence. And this time, perhaps I'll ask you, Jordan, to get us started.
Thanks. I mean, I think there's a lot of events that have occurred that have been brought up by the panelists that I think they can probably speak to those events a little better than myself. I think that for me, some things that stick out in terms of the events in the past 18 months, again, I'll mention again, the fact that we weren't paying attention to the social inequalities when it came to the public health response, right? Which we've done often in the past, and people have been criticized over that in past responses, that we're caring more about getting beds in hospitals or clinical care than dealing with these social inequalities in a population. So I think for me, a pivotal moment in the pandemic when there was this kind of shift in the priorities. And I think that came with a lot of groups asking for things like race-based data and mapping the issues, as Josephine mentioned, where we can actually identify where are these inequalities and then shift our priorities so that we can provide the programs to the appropriate populations and subpopulations, which we did see public health do that at one point, and where public health shifted to rather a top-down approach of addressing the pandemic and more going to the communities and going to community groups and getting community ambassadors. And I think for me, that was a really positive thing that happened quite too late, in my opinion, in the pandemic. But it does provide me hope for the future that we're seeing that how we need to prioritize our response and how important it is to be able to identify these social inequalities in order to properly address them.
Okay. Pamela, would you like to continue the thought?
Sure. Maybe I'll introduce something that happened recently that continues to build on the conversations that happened. The IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in August released its 6th assessment report, which was full of evidence around the further exacerbating climate emergency. And then later in August, it's tropical storm season. And so we saw flooding in New York. We saw people's housing flooded and destroyed in Louisiana. We've seen forest fires in other parts of Canada and extreme heat deaths rising across North America. And so it was interesting because as someone who's done research on climate change for over 30 years, one of the things I notice now that's different than before is that people are paying attention in different ways to the ways in which the impacts of climate change are affecting different communities of people. And so there was more news coverage, for example, of people who were dying from extreme heat, who lived in communities that didn't have access to air conditioning or weren't able to leave the apartments in which they live. There was more of a focus on the disproportionately negative and tragic impacts on racialized community members in terms of flooding in both the East Coast of the United States and the Southern United States. For example, people who live in basement apartments that aren't built to code faced more significant physical and economic impacts in the flooding in New York, in part because of the low quality of their housing, which of course is related to not having access to money to rent safer apartments. And so there's this interesting convergence in that I think through the pandemic, we've started to pay attention differently, but governments are being held to account to act differently too, which is important. And I don't want to paint it too rosily, but I think part of change is actually holding people to account and paying attention. And there is a different kind of acuity that I'm seeing in these particular cases, which I think in part comes from what has surfaced during the pandemic to people who are in positions of power.
Mm-hmm. Josephine, what do you think?
I think that Jordan and Pamela pointed out very important things. And there have been lots of lessons learned through COVID, and my concern is, but then what will happen afterwards? I like to share two stories based on our research, and we were finding our team actually had always expected, based on what happened with SARS and the kind of racism that had happened, we knew that the pandemic is going to lead to mental health crises among many communities. And at the beginning of the pandemic, what happened was, in the Asian communities, the elderly people who already have mental health challenges related to depression or anxiety, their mental health crisis become really heightened because they were afraid to go out for two reasons. They keep on hearing messages that if you're over 65, you're at high risk. You're likely going to catch it. At that time, we don't have the vaccine yet. On top of that, news stories showing elderly people being beaten up in Vancouver, in Toronto, everywhere, get them really, really fearful. So they become even more and more isolated. In cases where we hear, even when family were dropping food off, the elderly resident would not open the door. And then we had the lockdown, and you cannot really go and see your psychiatrist. Everything had to go online, and we know that there's also digital divide. People of certain age, if they're experiencing language barriers, if they had economic and financial difficulties, they're not going to be able to access services. So those became really big crises in the Asian communities, and we have documented the number of cases of violence. 700 hate crime increased in Vancouver alone against Asian people. But at the same time, I also appreciate what Jordan and Pam was saying, that people are seeing things differently. At that time, one of the ways that people want to cope, especially young people, is actually to become volunteers. And when businesses in the smaller community were closing, and the family-run business owners, they are not high-tech, they don't know how to do online, there were a team of young people going to those businesses and actually coaching how to switch businesses online. And there was community workers who actually bring Asian restaurants together with elderly, so that the restaurant, because they lost business, they became like Meals on Wheels kind of program, which I find is really innovative. And so I agree with what Pamela and Jordan is saying, is that within a crisis situation, that humanity can also come out and people become creative. And that was the thing that actually kept many of us very hopeful.
Absolutely. That's so a real focus on community capacity and community strength, really, to address unexpected issues in really creative and innovative ways. I'm glad you used the term innovative, actually, because that might come up as we think about the future. Beverly Jean, you started with with using the term convergence and sort of multiple issues coming together in the past 18 months. Do you want to add to that?
I think that the piece I would add to it is the issue of trauma, which Josephine talked about, and I would say it's often unrecognized trauma within Black communities. And I'll use the example of, if you're a young person at a school and a member of the school has died in a tragic accident, there's often social workers brought into those schools to help the students and the staff cope with it. Black communities witnessed the murder of George Floyd and the ongoing trauma of that, but there was no response in terms of any type of supports. That was that, we then added the COVID-19 pandemic onto that, which now, is a whole other layer of trauma. People are losing multiple family members. People are frontline workers. People are losing their homes because they're unable to afford to stay in their homes. So there are these multiple pieces that sort of continued to emerge as this this COVID-19 pandemic continued to spread. So I hear what Pamela is saying with regards to climate change, and my response is people can't think about the climate if they don't have food. People can't think about the climate if they don't have a roof over their heads, right? Or even as Jordan talked about the various ways in which the health coalitions have responded in equitable ways. Well, as a matter of fact, the Minister of Health initially said there's no need to collect race-based data. And it's not until Black community organizations came together and pushed and insisted, right, that there was that shift towards collecting race-based data. My hesitancy in terms of this sort of optimistic outlook is that what's being said today is nothing new, right? And there is this continued disposability of Black bodies and racialized bodies in our society, in which the varying forms of structural violence continue to be at play. And there are those of us who, yes, we're in the academy and we have the luxury and the privilege of looking at some of these issues from the outside, right? But there are many of us who are living in these communities that are impacted, and it's really difficult for us to see the light at the end of the tunnel when the tunnel has been in place for hundreds of years, right? So how do we begin to have different conversations in which those who are in positions of power and privilege are intentionally making adaptations, are intentionally addressing issues, as opposed to speaking about the issues?
Thank you, Beverly Jean. That's that's very interesting. Already is a fantastic panel because we now have a spectrum of perspective on the table. We have on the one hand, a sort of positive perspective around at least what is emerging from community as a spirit of innovation, a humanity and a form of dignity that is being valued within communities in terms of helping each other and so on. But then on the other hand, we also have the perspective that, structurally, not a lot is changing. Those in positions of power appear to be only sort of cooperating with some intervention and so on, only through resistance. In other words, it still takes a fight to get those in power to do anything at all and to acknowledge even the need for doing anything at all. So really, those are really quite different perspectives that are not mutually exclusive, I think, but that point to probably the being challenged to, on the one hand, not deteriorate into pessimism and sort of a helplessness about, well, this is what it is and what it must be, while at the same time not getting carried away in a hopefulness that perhaps continues to be mitigated by real structurally embedded power relations that are not fundamentally being altered in this context. So very, very interesting sort of set or spectrum of perspective that we have on the table. I do note, by the way, that one thing that wasn't mentioned just now are, of course, at least in the Canadian context, we heard a lot about long-term care facilities and just the elderly people in general, and have learned, I think, in no uncertain terms, and saw it on our TV screens, even heard it from the army, that our standards around caring for the elders are unacceptable. And yet, I'll be very curious to see whether that will actually change long term, or whether we will just find other ways of rationalizing that. So it'll be a very interesting development. But let's move from that a little bit and talk about where we go from here. The panel really is about, okay, what comes next? How can we build stronger and more resilient communities? Recognizing that it's not only about communities, it's also about policy, it is also about investment, it is also about narrative, and whose narrative actually is told and is placed at the center of things. So where do we go from here? How do we move forward? I wonder, maybe I'll call on you, Josephine, to get us started on that one.
Sure. So what you've raised about long-term care is something that we know for more than 2 decades. Mm-hmm. And all kinds of evidence has shown that privatized healthcare, especially long-term care, and even community care for elderly people, when it's profit, there's already limited resources, then where would the money go? And so I think that with this exposed during the pandemic, and it's heart-wrenching for many people who had lost their parents, grandparents, but it is really up to each one of us living in Canada to not just to let it go. The fact that we saw in the newspaper that our former premier could pass legislation that favored that kind of privatization, and at the same time also become board member, chair, that kinds of conflict, I think we need to have the opportunity to talk about it. What I really worried about is that when the wave 4 is over, hopefully there's no wave 5, everybody will only focus on economic recovery. But what about human life? What about dignity, as you said? And what about fairness? And I think all those things really need to come out, and all of us need to participate. And as Beverly had pointed out, this is not really about those of us who are privileged to have a job in a university, we do research. Every single one of us, our personal is political, our personal is professional, and it becomes really an ethical issue. At the same time, I also would like us to have a sense of optimism, because otherwise many of us cannot move forward. When I went through like media interviews and workshops and presentation on racism, on anti-Asian racism, it's traumatizing. I experienced that, and I need to have hope. And I promise my students, when I teach this topic, there'll always be examples that I bring out about what is being done that is ethical, that is useful, that will help us collectively to go forward. And for instance, I want to share an example. We do intervention, and in one of the group, I was working with, over 20 Asian immigrant women. And when they heard about the unmarked graves of children, Indigenous children, they were shocked. And they said, I didn't understand this. Where do I learn about this? We had a discussion. Their stereotype came out in the discussion that I had the opportunity to rebuttal. And afterwards, they invited me to go and talk to 100 women in their communities about Indigenous issue. So I think the solidarity, touching people in their hearts about ethics. After all, if we're human, then we need to behave and act and live like human. And I think that's the only thing that gives me hope.
Thank you, Josephine. Those are that's a call to ethics. That's in and of itself, I think, a powerful statement. Pamela, what do you think in terms of moving forward? Where do we go?
One of the things I think about ourselves as a campus community, and to this question of what does it mean to come back well, it's really important for us to be mindful of the places that continue to evolve and grow while we were away. And so, I think about the Ryerson community and our neighborhood around us. And I worry a little bit sometimes that as we start to think about coming back to campus, that some people might forget that our community that we are privileged to be a part of still carried on in the pandemic, even though 40,000 Ryerson community members weren't there. And so I think that for us as a community of people, as students and faculty and staff and alumni, we have a chance to really imagine ourselves as different kinds of community members when we come back. And I think that's both an interesting opportunity and a challenge, but also a caution to us. I'm teaching on campus right now, a small group of students, and it's really wonderful to be back. And so there will be joy in coming back together, but for other people, it will be hard. And for all of us, we'll be mindful of staying safe. And on top of that, we need to reintroduce ourselves to the community where our university is housed and think differently about how we can contribute to our community in different kinds of ways. And so I see that as both an opportunity and as a challenge.
Okay, fair enough, and thank you for the focus on the community of our institution as well. So that's that obviously is close to our hearts. Beverly Jean, where do we go?
Ms. Cesare talks about the way in which, as we dehumanize others, we lose our humanity, and I think this. Coming out of this, we have an opportunity to reground our humanity as a society, as members of communities, right? But I think part of that requires us to begin to have an engagement with the realities of our history, the realities of, as Josephine talked about, the indigenous children whose graves are being, and I use the idea of being literally and metaphorically being unearthed, because in the unearthing of those bodies, we're unearthing historical narratives, right? How do we use those histories and those stories to rebuild our humanity as a nation, as people? So I think that is a conversation that needs to be had. How do we want to move forward as a society, and who do we want to be as a society? I think we also need to think about ways in which we can provide supports for each other, right? So again, Josephine talks about the seniors being isolated, right? Are there ways in which we can begin to develop supportive networks between some of our young people and our seniors, so that we're building those relationships? How can we make counseling and that mental health support services more equitably available, right? I know of people who have been able to provide ongoing counseling supports for their children and their family members, even though it was virtual, but it's been provided throughout the pandemic. What about those other families who are going to emerge from this with varying forms of crises? How do we make counseling supports available? And how do we also foundationally look at our policies, practices, and procedures? What's missing? What needs to change? What needs to be added? And as well, whose voice needs to be at the table, right? How many times do we need to walk into meetings where policy decisions are being made and it's a completely white panel, right? Or a completely middle-class panel? And so I think this is also an opportunity for us to find voice and to create space for those who have been denied access to those spaces.
Excellent points all around. Really, really powerful points. Jordan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, excellent points by everyone. I think what I would add is I very much hope, I've said many times that we've never learned from the past, and we haven't in many emergencies and public health emergencies in particular. And, my hope is that there is a reinvestment and an interest in public health. And when I say public health, I'm talking about the holistic view of it. We're talking about environmental health and food security and housing and social supports. Often these are programs that are underfunded or defunded. And that was very much happening right up to leading to this pandemic. And, we always talk and we have global conferences about it, that, health we need to address the social determinants of health, right? And we need to have a focus on that. But we often do not do that. And if an emergency happens, such as a pandemic, we deal with it and then life goes back to normal, where we really need to reorient our health services and have that focus on the social determinants of health in our planning and in our responses, and with community engagements. We know that grassroots campaigns work to work with communities and not for communities. And as Beverly mentioned, have community representation, having that diversity on the workforce and having the perspectives and the experience and the connections of communities. So I really hope that we can, really take these lessons and go to a new future of how we look at health and how we look at health delivery and healthcare.
Thank you. Thanks, Jordan. It's such interesting points come up that that require discussion all of themselves, in and of themselves. I think, the reference to, for example, in making sure that we have counseling and mental health services. Of course, we've learned, not just during the past 18 months, but we've really known this for a long time, that different communities require different kinds of mental health services and different kinds of counseling services that are culturally responsive, that are responsive to how communities are, how people are together, the values, the spirituality, and all of those elements. And one always fears, I think, when identifying a particular service that might be needed to address a gap or an inequity, that in addressing it in one particular way, we are simply replicating the sort of the exclusions in a different way. But somebody always seems to get left out. Somebody always seems to not be responded to, which I think highlights Beverly's point about the importance of voice, to really combat that. Just the other observation I'd just like to share, because Josephine spoke to the issue of dignity. One of the things that I have found really startling throughout these past 18 months is the humanization of the economy, or giving the economy personhood. You hear all these stories about the economy requires this, the economy must do that, as if the economy is like Henry, like a person that kind of is our buddy in some way. And at the same time, we dehumanize the actual people who are subject to that economy, who live within that economy, who also create that economy, and are its blood, really. So very interesting. I wonder sometimes whether we are working toward humanization and the creation of dignity again, or whether we are actually working toward replacing humanity with concepts that we imbue personhood. As if they actually had that, as if the economy were our friend that we hang out with. Kind of an interesting thing. I do want to ask each of you, through your different perspectives, about the issue of trauma, because you brought it up. Several of you brought it up. You've spoken to sort of racial trauma that is happening, but also trauma that results from experiencing responses to the pandemic, lockdowns, isolation, and those kinds of things. Trauma is not something that is healed in a day. It is, the responding to trauma is a very much a long-term, often intergenerational project. So how do you think that has to change the conversation about whether it's building back or building forward or building differently post-pandemic? How does that change things, knowing that we are building in the context of people who have long-standing multiple centuries of trauma that they're carrying, as well as new, fresh, sort of isolation-based pandemic-related trauma? How does that impact things? I wonder, Josephine, I think you spoke about trauma as well. Can you respond to that?
Yeah, so you raise a very good point. So trauma could be multi-generational, and you've also mentioned about fresh trauma. I don't think people can heal unless the fresh trauma continue, unless it's stopped. Mm-hmm. It's really hard for people to overcome anything when every day, any moment. And I often talk about that, in classroom with my friends, that even though I'm a racialized woman, I seldom had to worry about my children in my life not coming home because of carding, police violence, and that kind of stuff. The other thing that happened is traumatizing actually healthcare providers. And then watching recent news about people protesting outside of institutions really breaks my heart. In our study, we found that people who are working with children with disabilities, working with families who had children with autism spectrum, and with the lockdown and all that stuff, these children had no access to the kind of daily activities and programs that they had to. And some of the healthcare providers had to make the moral decision about are they going to increase the medication because that's the only way when the whole family would not break down. Those are trauma. People talk about how the elderly are dying and they're caring for them, and yet they cannot touch them except through gloved hands. Those are things that they go home and they had nightmare about. We have participants who've gone through crisis in a long-term care, and it's 6 months later that they were able to even sign up to come to a stress reduction course. So I really feel that trauma, people talk about as if trauma is an individual incident. It's not. It's tied to the context. And there are certain things that when we experience so much that it could just be a little comment by someone, and yet that really bring out those type of emotions in us that we are actually frozen and could not do anything anymore. And so I think this is something that we do have to pay attention to, and also resist allowing people to kind of also make trauma into just, this trend that we talk about. This is people's real life, and we cannot just take it lightly. And what you brought out about human dignity is very important, but I also think is very important based on what Pamela talked about, climate change and all that stuff. Indigenous leader talking about two-eye seeing. We need to learn from wisdom from different cultures and indigenous people, because there are all kinds of wisdom and solution in there that we would not do that. So one thing is really to fight off the kind of white supremacy in the way we understand knowledge, the way we know about things, and the way that we interact with each other based on relations, based on relationship and that kind of stuff.
Absolutely, thank you, Josephine. Pamela, I'm curious. You have been studying cities, immersed in cities for a long time. You're a planner. Is there such a thing as trauma-informed planning? Is that a thing?
It is. We didn't say we were allowed to do this, but I'm gonna take license. I'm gonna share an article from Policy Options written by Canadian urbanist and placemaker Jay Pitter. And Jay wrote about traumatized landscapes and the practice of city building. So I just shared it in the link for everyone to look at. When you came to me next, I thought I'm the least qualified of all of us as a planner. Thinking about trauma it should be more part of our training, and it's not. But I want to pick up on a thread that Beverly Jean raised earlier about the need to fundamentally rethink our policies and procedures and practices. And, one of the things I think that's really tangible in our efforts to gather people, to ask them about the kinds of places and the kinds of changes they want in the communities in which they live, that we're going to have to do differently, is we're going to have to plan to use more time. In that when we gather people together to talk about where they are and where they might want to go, public meetings are notoriously short right now. Many of them are still, being done virtually. These spaces and processes aren't conducive to people being able to talk about the experiences they have. And people who have experienced trauma sometimes need space and time in these environments to be able to talk about their experiences. And so in our haste to try to move beyond the pandemic, I worry that we're not going to make the changes to the ways in which we have conversations together about where we want to go. And making time is really part of it. And many processes of change are intended to be quick and to get to outcomes quickly. And so I think we're going to have to slow down. But on the question about trauma-informed planning practice, I'll defer to Jay Pitter's article in the chat, which I just shared with everyone, because she's wiser than me. And I'll pass on the microphone.
Thank you so much, and thank you for sharing the article. And I would be disappointed if my colleagues did not go outside of the bounds of the plan and do whatever it is they think is awesome. So thank you for sharing that, Pamela. Beverly Jean, do you want to just pick up on that topic, because you also have talked a lot about trauma? And
I think part of the, sort of building out Pamela saying that we need to hear the stories and we need to create space for those stories. So I'm doing this simultaneous agreeing with you and disagreeing with you, Pamela. And I say that because oppressed bodies are sort of tired of telling their stories, right? And the stories aren't being heard. All right, so there's this resistance to telling those stories, particularly in integrated spaces, right? And part of my work looks at the way in which the telling of the stories in closed spaces really allows for people to process the information differently, and to engage in more sort of intentional work around the healing, right? And one of the ways in which I talk about trauma, particularly in racialized communities, is that this notion of these sort of discrete forms of trauma, they sound good. But when you're living with vicarious trauma, acute trauma, chronic trauma, and complex trauma all at the same time, every single day, and there is no escape from it simply because of the color of your skin, right? It's beyond the telling of the stories. It is about, what access to services are they going to be, right? How many people are you going to hire in the policy division? How many people are you going to hire in the medical profession? How many young people are you going to provide paid internships for, so that they're able to generate an income to allow for the family to move out of those spaces of poverty, right? Because we know that a lot of the challenges that Black communities are experiencing because of race are also compounded by issues of poverty, right? And one of the things that's also of concern to me is that there's not been any real conversation about the increasing rates of suicide in Black communities. And there's been a staggering increase in the past 10 years, when historically Blacks have had the lowest suicide rates across all groups. So it's not only that we're talking about trauma in a theoretical way, we're talking about trauma in terms of, loss of life, loss of human capacity, destabilization of communities, and space also contributes to that trauma, right? Which areas of our community are well lit? What are the paint colors that's used in certain parts of the communities? Why is it that I can drive through Etobicoke and find these massive, beautiful plant arrangements on the street during the summer, but if I go to a lower income neighborhood, there's garbage. There's, so there are so many pieces that I think we have to work at it at the same time, as opposed to, we'll do one thing this year and then 10 years later, when there's another crisis, we might do something else. So,
fair point. Fair point. Thank you. Before we, Jordan, I want to ask you if you would like to share something about sort of how you grapple with the concept of trauma in thinking about these things.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I appreciate this discussion very much. I find that in my experiences in responding to, acute crises, there's not enough discussion about trauma, and there's not enough discussion about or care about the indirect health impacts and the long-term health consequences. The crisis is over, and so let's move on. So I think it's really important that, we advocate for keeping up this conversation and ensuring that, and keep people accountable for addressing and understanding the long-term health consequences that are going to result from this pandemic.
Excellent, thank you. We have some questions from the audience, and I also want to prepare you for how we're going to end the panel. And we're going to end the panel by me asking you for a call to action. Okay, my last question to you will be about what can people who are listening to this right now or who may watch this video, what can they do now? You know, what is the call to action that you would like to make? But I'm gonna first bring in a few audience questions, because I'd rather end on the call to action than have it now and then have audience questions. So if that's okay with everybody, but I thought I'd give you the heads up. And the first question, you know, really is a question about language to some extent, but we've learned during the past 18 months that language is so incredibly important. And the question essentially suggests that, you know, the phrase "build back better" is a memorable phrase because of the alliteration. But it also feels a little bit like we're building a better mousetrap. And so the suggestion is, why not use the phrase "build better forward" as opposed to "build back better"? You know, it may seem banal to talk about language, but we've learned that language is never really banal, and is really structurally and through a power lens very important. So just briefly, you know, if each of you could comment on that, build back better versus build better forward. What do you think about that? Starting, we'll start with Pamela.
Thanks. You know, I think that, you know, I don't know, like maybe I'm naturally resistant, but I don't really know if these kinds of rallying cries ever really resonate with the right folks, both for the people for whom we need, you know, that we have a debt to do better for and with, but also to the people actually making decisions in positions of power. I feel like those are the kinds of, I sound so cynical after an election, but it's the kind of rhetoric. I don't want to hear people talking. I'd rather see actions rather than hear the words, right? So I would like the evidence that things are different. I'm not trying to sidestep it, but it's a tricky one, because to the point about building a better mousetrap, I don't know how to say it better. I just think we need to do it better.
Okay, fair enough. Fair point. That's a clear answer, I think.
With
George?
affection to the person who asked it, because I think the spirit of the question is a really good one. And I love the critical unpacking, but that's my answer. Yeah.
Good. Jordan, would you like to weigh in?
I have to say, if it, you know, just on the spot, I think "build better forward" is great as well. I have to say I completely agree with Pamela that I think it's not about really, you know, what the catchphrase is or how we phrase it. It's really about the action behind it. And "build back better" or "build better forward" could work fantastically if there's actual action following up to that.
Fair enough. Okay, so we're still on words aren't going to change the world. Okay, Beverly Jean, any thoughts?
I think I have to jump on the same bandwagon.
Okay. It's a rare moment, by the way, so let's enjoy it. Go ahead, Beverly Jean.
You know, I think we've all sort of been on the same bandwagon for, you know, pretty much the entire session, but I think we've just been coming at it from different spaces. And I think I do agree, right? It's not about building back something that was dysfunctional, right? It's like taking your car to the mechanic and paying the mechanic to make your car still not work, right? We really want to pay the mechanic for your car to function better, right? So what concretely do we need to do so that we can do things better, with the recognition that there is not going to be any overnight dismantling of the system, right? There are still systemic structures that we are going to have to figure out how to function within while changing it, right? So we don't completely rip the car apart to fix the brakes. But what are the priorities that we need to look at? What are the first things that we really need to look at so that the people who are most impacted can be supported in terms of moving forward and experiencing a better quality of life and outcomes?
Excellent point. I wish you would have told me I didn't need to rip my car apart to fix the brakes earlier. You know, that would have really helped and saved me some money. But thank you. Excellent points, I think. Josephine, would you What's your thought on that one?
Yes, so I think people who come out with the Build Back Better is probably into health communication, and they want to have BBB, 3Bs, B to the threes or whatever. But I do like the word back, but not Build Back Better, because we cannot move forward unless we acknowledge the past. And I think that looking back and looking at all the ills, all the wrongs, all the injustices will be one thing to remind us to actually build better forward. And so I think that maybe 6 words could be reshuffled and put in new words and come out with a better slogan for us to do.
Excellent. And it's a very valuable point. You do have to look into the past to understand the future and to build the future. So that's an excellent point. Thank you for that. We have another question that introduces an interesting dynamic. So just your quick responses to this one. So this question really expresses a degree of skepticism about the capacity of our political leaders to really lead the way forward in a better way. And then on the other hand, we've seen that there is enormous capacity in communities to really have an impact within communities, sometimes between communities, and to create meaningful change. And so the question really is, do we focus on political leaders? Do we focus on community in spite of political leaders? Is there a problem with letting political leaders off the hook and focusing on community instead? What are the dynamics at play here that make this actually a very complicated thing to respond to? What do you think? Maybe this time we'll start with you, Jordan.
Yeah, in my experience, they're not two separate things. Public health promotion, these are politically based. A lot of times action doesn't happen, funding doesn't happen, healthy public policy isn't put into place without the pressure on politicians. And on the other hand, these types of issues and emergencies can get extremely politicized, which then makes it difficult for action. But there is a huge role in the community and in community engagement and in community empowerment to put that pressure on the political leaders in order to enact change, enact healthy public policy, put in supportive programs. So the politics isn't going to leave from public health and from response, but we need to hold them accountable and put pressure, via our community resources and strength.
Excellent point. Beverly Jean, do you want to add to that?
I think part of the challenge around the viability sometimes of community resourcing is that those community organizations rely on the funding that's provided to agencies, right? And as well, it's coming from the government. It's a funding is a political issue, right? So when we look at the ways in which community-based organizations engage in various forms of resistance, even that becomes very much connected to politics. And I think we need to think through what are some of the accountability measures that can be built into place that protects community organizations, that ensures the funding for these organizations so that they can do this grassroots work, right? So we look at, when a new government comes into power, what gets cut first? Right? It's typically the services that people need the most. Is there some way of moving forward that we are able to put some type of a moratorium on cutting funding to primary services? Right? I don't know. This is me in my fantasy world. So irrespective of the government, there's something in our society that says a minimum of X percentage must go towards these types of support services, whether it's for the elderly, whether it's, for people living with disabilities, whatever the case may be. there has to be that aspect of the social contract which says we must protect those who are most vulnerable in our society, irrespective of the political machinations that are happening in our world.
Thank you. Pamela, you had alluded to this question of politics and community before. Any further comments on that?
I think I'm going to build on what Beverly Jean just said around the kinds of political moves that get attention and how they change it. And I'll just point to something that we haven't spoken to specifically yet, but I think and hope is relevant, is about the tension between celebrating the new and the big shiny move versus the importance of maintaining relationships and investments in existing communities and places. We're like the cover of the newspaper is usually, a ribbon cutting, new shovels in the ground. But in infrastructure budgeting, there's something called state of good repair, which is the money you need to keep something in good working order. You don't want to throw money at things you don't want to persist in investing in bad infrastructure that results in terrible outcomes. But some infrastructure is really important to maintain, and maintenance isn't sexy. And so just to build on Beverly Jean's point about rethinking the way in which money flows through government, protecting important things from political whimsy is really important. I'll add to it that re-celebrating the maintenance of good things should be as laudatory and praised as something new and shiny, because sometimes the new and shiny thing isn't going to deliver anything good for 25 years, or it may never happen. And so training ourselves as community members and participants in democratic processes too, to not always be seduced by the new big thing, but to really double down on supporting infrastructures of communities that really matter is really important too.
Well said. Thank you for that point. That's an excellent addition to all the points made on this question. I want to cover at least one or two other questions. So here is a question that I think is really important to ask because it speaks to a particular community. And I'm just going to read the question because it's perfectly phrased. So the question essentially is, Dr. Wong raised some excellent points about individuals with disabilities who have been impacted greatly by the pandemic. This is often something that is dismissed as there are so many other inequities in our society. How do you anticipate the voice of those with disabilities being heard? For example, visual, physical, cognitive, or other impairments. Often these individuals also encounter many other barriers and inequities. So if we can focus a little bit on the disability community in responding to this, that would be nice. And since it was spurred by your comments, Josephine, I'll ask you to respond first.
So that's really an important question. And I think that in the last 15 years or so, there are more and more people on the ground at the grassroots, as well as in research and policy, to look at intersectionality. So when we're talking about communities that are marginalized because of their different abilities, certain disabilities, we are talking, I think that this really ties back to the last question. How would they be able to get their voices done? This is where policy and grassroots are both important strategies, in a sense that we still live in an inequitable but democratic society. And for the longest time, marginalized group had always counted on people within their communities and allies to actually build up voices. So for instance, I really think that we just had an election. One way is actually to hold our politicians accountable, regardless of what party they come in. But at the same time, we need to acknowledge that even across the different political parties, they all don't have the similar kind of power. Who had more money to run what kind of campaign? But each one of us need to believe that the rights to vote was not really granted to all people in Canada at the beginning. Black people were not allowed to vote. Asian people were not allowed to vote. Women were not allowed to vote. And so I think that this is where the empowerment can come in, not individual resilience, but collectively we can do something. I'm thinking about how hard it is for a family when the parents had to work 5 jobs together to feed the family, where would they have time to actually go and advocate and say even anything? But they're always community agency. There's organization that's not even agency, because people believe in the dignity, the humanity part, that people will come out. And I really feel that this is one way, is to first of all find out who in our communities actually are putting out the voices, and we connect with them. And at the same time, these community organizations learning from COVID need to begin to think about, how do I make it even more accessible, so that there's no exclusion among marginalized voices within marginalized voices. So those are the kind of power dynamics that we need to think about, and always think about the different groups. And, you know, there's nothing that is simple. Things are complex. We just have to fight in a complex way.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Beverly Jean, do you want to add anything around disability communities in particular and the voices of people with disabilities?
I think there's a number of ways in which we also have to look at disabilities when we're talking about intersectionalities as well, right? Because we did see that when there was funding cuts for children with autism, right? Middle class, predominantly white mothers were able to come together and make a stand and to challenge those cuts, right? And we have seen some responses to those cuts, right? So that's sort of one slice of the conversation, right? When we now layer on the multiple sides of oppression in terms of class, sexual identity, and we add all of that onto to disabilities, how does that experience then change? So I think first and foremost, we have to recognize that simply clumping the notion of disabilities together isn't helpful for the dialogue. We really need to unpack it a bit more comprehensively so that our responses are targeted, right? If we look, for example, the cost of having a psychoeducational assessment done is what, close to $4,000, right? Who can afford to do that? Who has access to the support to be able to do that? Then you look at kids who are in lower socioeconomic environments who are in need of those tests or who are in need of those supports. It's not provided because it's not built into the system, right? So I think we have to unpack the term disabilities. We really need to look at it with an intersectional lens, because it's at that point in time that we would be able to be much more targeted in terms of how we address the issues that are presenting. So I think it's like all other issues, it's complex, but I think it does require that unpacking so that we can look at interventions much more appropriately.
Okay, okay. Pamela, would you like to comment on sort of the disability context in this?
Just to further add that, you know, one of the habits we need to leave behind us is just trying to find quick, easy, one-size-fits-all solutions to complex problems. And I think because planners we're parts of institutions, and I think institutions that show their community members that they really see them and respect them and value them, that's a foundational value, right? And so just, you know, we have to get better at recognizing all of the kinds of people that we work with, and stop trying to just make it easy and tidy with blunt solutions. We really need to get better at that.
Okay. I want to, sorry, Jordan, yes?
I just wanted to quickly add that I appreciate this question and comment, and I do think that this is often a group that can be overlooked. And I just want to add that this has been identified as a gap in terms of getting the viewpoints and understanding, you know, the challenges and potential solutions when it comes to this population. And there is ongoing research right now. I am part of a research group where we are getting the viewpoints of people with disabilities and understanding what their challenges are and what potential solutions could be, and providing this information to decision makers.
Excellent. Good. Thank you for sharing that. We're almost out of time, but I want to get to the call to action. And I'm just going to ask each of you to, very briefly and concisely talk about what is the call to, what are you asking people to do? And I just want you to have in the back of your mind as you do that, a couple of questions that relate and that may have come from either students or alumni, because in our audience, I assume that we have many students and alumni present. And I don't want to lose those questions. I just want to honor the fact that we are, after all, deeply connected to students and our alumni. So one person asked, what advice do you have for students that have financial restrictions for dealing with post-pandemic trauma? And another person asked, how can students and alumni assist our community during this pandemic time and in the future? So these are kind of really nice questions to frame a little bit a round of call to actions. And so if you don't mind, we'll try and be concise, but I'll ask each of you to take the opportunity and speak to your call to action. And this time we'll start with Beverly Jean, if you don't mind. Go for it.
I would like to see, actually, let me start off with the two questions, because I think they're very much connected to the work that I do, right? So what advice do you have for students that have financial restrictions? I think this is where it is absolutely vital for students to be made aware of the varying forms of bursaries and scholarships that are available. So if we look at FCS, or even if we look at CYC, there are so many awards that students aren't necessarily aware of, and they don't apply for it. So one of the things that I have tried to do with students is I actually schedule sessions where I say, okay, a group of us, we're going to get together on a particular day and we are going to apply for scholarships, right? So that's our scholarship application day. Right? How can we as faculty support students in doing that? Funny enough, I got a request from a young woman today to be a reference for her on a scholarship, right? Typically, the students who are the ones in the most need are the ones who don't know. Right. So as a faculty, we have to find ways to ensure that students are more aware of the scholarships that are available. And how can students assist, students and alumni assist? When I think of the number of students who we have graduating, let's say out of social work programs, there are ways in which we can bring those students back to provide supports for the incoming group of students, right? So if we're graduating Masters of Social Works, students who have a counseling focus, or we're graduating Masters of CYC who have a therapeutic focus, are there ways in which we might be able to draw on their services to be able to support incoming students? I think that would create a really nice bridge between old and new students. And finally, I think one of the arguments that I've been making is it's absolutely vital for us to invest in children in our communities. However, I think what we're forgetting is that those who are in post-secondary institutions, investing in them and ensuring that they complete their educational journeys does have a much quicker turnaround in terms of us being able to reap the benefits, right? If it's done in a strategic and intentional and informed way, right? So I think we do have to be sort of supporting multiple investment streams, recognizing that investment in our younger years does have long-term potential, but also investing in those who are closer to the end of their academic journeys. We can get them into the workforce faster. We can prepare them for getting more viable employment opportunities, which also then means that they are better positioned to support the needs of their families and their communities. So I think it's sort of multiple pieces that we have to look at the same time.
Excellent.
That's sort of my dream. If we can support the students, we're better able to support communities.
Thank you. Thank you. Josephine, your call to action.
Yes, so Beverly had, laid out a lot of really pragmatic strategies. And I think another way that students who are experiencing financial challenges, can also, talk to some of the program coordinators. They're also on-campus job as research assistants or as other ways that they can engage. And sometimes those experiences also support their learning. In terms of call to action, I really think that is a commitment for me. I'll speak for myself individually, but also in the context of being together, is how do we move forward and create a place where really everyone, not just some people, can really live in a way that is free from suffering, that is preventable, so that people can actually live to their full potential, everybody reaching their full potential when we all can really live, play, work, and die with dignity in where we are, and acknowledging the past, and then thinking about how am I co-creating the future. And for alumni and students who have the time and energy and commitment to volunteer, I think is also an excellent way to connect, to become, together in solidarity, to focus on whatever each one of us are passionate about, because there's so many things that we can contribute to.
Thank you, Josephine. Thank you. Jordan, your call to action.
Thank you. I just want to acknowledge the fact that the question was about dealing with post-pandemic trauma and having financial issues. And I know that this has been an issue for a lot of our students. And I've had conversations with a lot of students of what they've really been going through over the past 18 months. And please be aware that there are a lot of services available at Ryerson that are free, mental health services. And I know just from talking to students that sometimes you might be aware of the services, but not utilize them. So I think it's really important that we encourage each other and our peers to reach out if you're in need of those services, that they are there for you free of charge. In terms of a call to actions, I really think really awareness and as individuals, understanding the social inequalities that exist in different groups, but also the resources and strengths that exist that are available to draw upon within communities, and building these intersectoral partnerships that are really important for us moving forward. And I think for me, I've talked a lot about learning from the past and actually putting things into action. And to be able to do that, we need research, we need data, we need evidence. In order to, we have to be able to measure health equity, and we have to be able to measure social inequalities so that we can get the resources and put in the resources and put in the appropriate programs to the right group. So I think those would be my two big calls to action. And as well, as I mentioned before, and Beverly mentioned, really having that diversity component in our workplaces, so that we can learn from communities, so that we have connections with communities and experience from the communities.
Excellent, thank you. And Pamela, I believe you started, or at least I started by introducing you first. So now I'm going to let you also complete the process. Your call to action.
Yeah, we have very little time, so I'll be quick. I think because this is a panel on Alumni Week, I'm going to focus on alumni. It's not a call to action, but a little bit of a plea for help. Here are three real things that I think most of our schools and our students could use help with. The first one is, if you're in a position in the place that you work to bring in a student intern or a placement student in a paid position, they really need your help. That's like a real material thing you can do. If in the course of your work or your community advocacy, that's not an option for you, try to advocate to someone who can do it the importance of paid work for students that's connected to their education. It's vital to helping students open the door to the next steps. The other thing I'll say is that in our school, we have been extraordinarily fortunate through the leadership of our alumni. Very quickly in the last 18 months, they mobilized endowed awards for Black students and Indigenous students in the School of Urban and Regional Planning. And it was only by alumni initiative and hard work and sleeves rolled up and tremendous generosity and support from the folks in advancement at Ryerson. And so not everyone is in a position to make a donation or a contribution, but if you are, these kinds of awards are being established or could be enriched across all of our schools. And they make a really big difference. They make a difference not only because they're money to help students support their education, but also moving forward, having an award on a student's resume helps celebrate their excellence in a way that external people can recognize. And that can also be important in the career development of our students. So my final pitch is, if you're in a position to help make a contribution to support a student award, it can really make a difference. And we'd be very appreciative of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. And that's an important message, of course, absolutely. And we have in our faculty in particular, but across the institution, really benefited from people's generosity to support students through awards and scholarships and so on. I will just end by saying two things. First, I'm reminded that Josephine at one point brought up the issue of ethics. And I would just like to say that it ought to be, my call to action really is, it ought to be okay to think about ethics, care, and kindness, and not make that be things that are not specific or concrete or whatever. These things matter. These things drive the way we experience our lives. So I really think we should celebrate those terms and make them real. And secondly, I just want to say to our panelists a gigantic thank you for doing this. I've deviated from the script left, right, and center, and you were able to just pick up and go with it, no problems, no questions asked. So that was absolutely fantastic. A great appreciation for your participation in this. I'm going to hand it over to Robert because we are in slight overtime. So thank you so much. Much appreciated. Robert.
So much, Chiaris. Absolutely. Thank you to our panelists for that really fascinating discussion. And thank you, Chiaris, for moderating it as well. It's clear from all your comments today that we really do have to focus on the social determinants of health as we emerge from the pandemic. And this is a conversation that's happening every day in the Faculty of Community Services. And we invite everybody watching to join us as we keep that conversation going. So please follow the faculty on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. Keep an eye out in your inboxes for a brief questionnaire where you can let us know if you would like to learn more about any of the opportunities mentioned today. And please don't hesitate to contact me directly or any of my colleagues here at FCS, either to discuss the issues raised or if you'd like to learn more about supporting our students and our work. Alumni Week continues right now with the President's Address as our President and Vice Chancellor shares Vision 2030 and his thoughts on the coming decade. But in the meantime, thank you so much to all our speakers, to Beverly Jean Daniel, Pamela Robinson, Jordan Tustin, Josephine Wong, and Chiaris Garabaghi. And thanks to you all for joining us today. Bye for now.